All right, thank you. Yes, oh, you have another example? Oh, perfect, thank you. All right, that's 1804. All right, thank you. And you want to approach on the other issue? All right, yes. All right, we ready for the jury? Okay. All right, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. All right, be seated. All right, the plaintiff has rested in the defense case. Your witness?
Your Honor, I'd like to call Dr. Don Hughes to the stand.
Dr. Hughes.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm to testify truthfully in this case for penalty of law? Yes, I do.
Good afternoon, Your Honor.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Your Honor. Will you please state your name?
Dawn Hughes.
And what is your profession?
I am a clinical and forensic psychologist.
And where is your practice located?
I practice in New York City.
What is a clinical psychologist?
Sure, so a clinical psychologist is somebody who assesses, evaluates, and treats individuals who are suffering from a variety of ailments or problems that they have in their lives. It could be a major psychiatric disorder, and it could be problems in living. Clinical psychologists also participate in training, in education, and in research ventures.
And what is a forensic psychologist?
So a forensic psychologist is someone who applies the science and principles of clinical psychologists to a particular legal question at hand.
And please describe your background in terms of your education, please, for us.
So I received my bachelor degree in psychology from Hamilton College, which is in upstate New York. I then received my master's degree and my PhD from Nova Southeastern University, which is in Florida. I then had to complete my year-long internship, and that was at Yale University in the School of Medicine in the Department of Psychiatry. And there I did 2 full-year rotations. I did a year rotation in the Substance Abuse Treatment Unit and another year rotation in the West Haven Mental Health Clinic, where we saw individuals suffering from a wide array of difficulties and psychiatric illnesses. After that, I had to complete my postdoctoral fellowship, which is another year that's required in order to get licensed. And that was back in New York at Cornell Medical College in the Anxiety and Traumatic Stress program there.
Please describe your training and experience in psychology and trauma.
So my experience in trauma has been predominantly throughout graduate school. I started at a domestic violence program that was housed within our community mental health center of the university. And that program, we saw both men and women who were coming through the program. The majority of the men were court-ordered for batterers intervention programs to participate in mostly group therapy because of their behavior in intimate partner violence, domestic violence. We also treated the female victims who were victims of intimate partner violence mostly in individual therapy, but we did run some groups there as well. After that practicum experience, I went to work at the Veterans Administration in their outpatient psychiatry clinic. And in that clinic, I treated mostly, this was Florida, so they're much older adults. So we saw a lot of Vietnam-era veterans and actually World War II veterans in that program, and a few of veterans who served combat in the first Iraq War. Sort of overlapping in that time, I also was the research coordinator for the Child Sex Abuse Survivors Program, and that was also a treatment program that was housed within that same community mental health center. And we saw individuals, both men and women, who were coming for treatment to deal with the consequences, the psychological after effects of having been sexually abused as a child. After that, I completed my internship when I was at Yale at the substance abuse program because we know there's a high concordance, a high rate of trauma-based disorders with substance abuse. I put together a group, a women's group of female heroin addicts, recovering heroin addicts who also had either domestic violence or childhood abuse histories. So we did a dual substance abuse harm reduction model with the healing from the traumatic effects of the violence that they experienced. On my postdoctoral fellowship, I was in the Anxiety and Traumatic Stress program. As the name sounds, we saw individuals who were suffering from trauma-based disorders and anxiety, mostly late adolescents and adults, men and women, from rape, sexual assault, violence. Some were simple assaults on the streets, being mugged, and things of that nature. I also did teaching and training for Victim Services, which is New York City's largest victim-based organization who runs a lot of services for victims of domestic violence and shelter-based programs. And I did some education and training for them and teaching for a number of years.
Thank you. Let's talk about your current occupation. What positions do you currently hold?
So I currently have a private practice in Manhattan, and I also have a faculty position at Weill Cornell Medical College. I'm a clinical assistant professor of psychology in the Department of Psychiatry there. This is what we call on the voluntary faculty, which means you don't get paid, but you participate in bringing in the interns, selecting the interns for that year. In that program, I teach, I think for the past 7-8 years, the ethics seminar to the interns, and also participate in other didactics that they have. I'm also called upon to sort of troubleshoot difficult scenarios that clinicians, either trainees or full-blood clinicians, might have if there's an issue of intimate partner violence or child sex abuse and they don't really know sort of what to do in that situation. I get consulted to do that. And then most recently, I was part of our program's COVID response team, where in pretty much March, April, May, June, July 2020, where New York City was the epicenter, we sort of mobilized and were really doing psychological first aid and helping our hospital-based workers deal with the stress and the trauma from seeing so much death and destruction because of COVID in those first months of New York City's COVID wave.
What does your independent practice entail?
So my independent practice is predominantly, I say 3 things. The bulk is I see individuals in therapy, 2.5 days. I see people who come to my office who are mostly dealing from, the traumatic effects of victimization, childhood abuse, rape, sexual assault, sexual harassment, domestic violence. And I see these individuals in therapy. I do have a percentage of individuals who do not have a trauma history, and that's usually the anxiety disorders that I see. They may have panic disorder or generalized anxiety disorder or other difficulties in just relational difficulties or problems in living. The second big part of what I do is this, forensic psychology, like I am doing here today. I evaluate individuals who were involved in legal matters. I consult with prosecutors and district attorneys and U.S. attorneys on their cases, and just something that has to do with the legal system. And then the other smaller percentage is the engagement in professional activities in the profession.
Do you have any areas that you specialize in?
Yes, I specialize in interpersonal violence and traumatic stress.
And what is interpersonal violence?
So interpersonal violence is the umbrella term for when one person does something violent or abusive toward another. And that includes domestic violence, childhood sexual abuse, rape, sexual assault, sexual harassment, physical assault. All of those type of behaviors we understand as interpersonal violence. And then the traumatic stress is the consequence of that. What happens to individuals when they experience these sort of life-altering events, these really adverse life events? Traumatic stress is one of the outgrowths and the psychological consequences that people have when they've been exposed to these type of traumas.
So intimate partner violence, rape, and sexual assault are major areas of your focus of practice?
That's
Is that
correct.
Fair to say?
Objection leading.
I'll sustain the objection.
Okay. I'll just move on. What types of patients do you treat in your private office?
So I treat adults, mostly men and women in my practice. I sometimes will treat late adolescents, 17 or 18. They'll come to me usually after a rape or sexual assault, and I'll treat them in short-term treatment. But mostly adults who are, have sustained some kind of traumatic event in their lives.
Approximately how many victims of interpersonal violence have you examined or personally interviewed over the course of your career?
Hundreds upon hundreds.
And how many years have you been practicing?
Well, I started practicing in graduate school in 1992, and I was licensed in 1996, so 25, 30 years.
Okay. Are you board certified?
Yes, I am.
Please describe to the jury what board certification means and what you are certified in.
Board certification is the highest degree of postdoctoral certification that a psychologist can obtain. And I am board certified in forensic psychology, and that means that I have just amassed a competency in the area of forensic psychology.
And are you licensed to practice psychology?
Yes, I am.
And in how many states are you licensed?
I'm licensed in 3 states, in New York, North Carolina, and Connecticut, and then I have some temporary licenses in other states as well.
Have you published in the area of your specialization?
I have. I am not predominantly a researcher or somebody who writes. I'm a clinician. I'm doing direct clinical service, but over the course of my graduate school and postdoctoral time, I have published some things, yes.
And have you published a book chapter relating to rape and sexual assault?
Objection
yes,
leading.
Overruled.
Yes, I have. Rape and sexual assault in adult women.
And have you published any book chapters relating to structured or clinical assessment of risk or violence?
Yes, I co-authored a book chapter entitled, this is a Structured Clinical Assessment of Risk and Violence.
Have you given any other trainings or presentations to mental health professionals in the area of trauma and abuse?
Yes, I've given many trainings at national conferences, at legal conferences for attorneys, for mental health professionals, on understanding trauma and how trauma may show up in the courtroom, on understanding what a victim of intimate partner violence might look like, of understanding the difficulties that a rape victim might have to come into court to testify, and training just regular sort of mental health professionals on how to understand trauma, how to look for trauma, what does it look like when it comes into your office, how do you treat it, how do you assess it. All of those factors I've done a number of trainings on.
Have you been invited on any occasions to train attorneys and judges on trauma and violence?
Yes, I have. I was invited by the Judicial Conference to be part of the training curriculum to train our New York State Supreme Court justices on issues of intimate partner violence and traumatic stress. Some of the things that I've just been talking to you here about how to understand what happens in those situations, how to understand the myths and misconceptions that may abound in these situations, and how you can sort of more accurately understand what a victim is talking to you about and telling you when they come into your courtroom.
Have you given any presentations to judicial symposiums on domestic violence?
Yes, I've also been contacted by, sometimes judges will have symposiums in their courtroom. They will make a decision to hold a particular symposium on particular topics, and I was asked to come to presentations for judges on numerous occasions.
And what, if any, presentations did you do on understanding women's use of force in IPV?
That was a recent presentation. I think that was invited by one of the judges of the Office on Domestic Violence in New York. And the title is When Women Use Force in Situations of Intimate Partner Violence. And my topic was to talk about the complexities of that issue and what does that look like and how can we differentiate if both people are fighting, how do we know that this is intimate partner violence? So what does the research tell us about that? How do we understand that and how can we really accurately assess that? And that was sort of the bulk of what that training was about.
What professional organizations do you belong to?
I belong to a number. I belong to the American Psychological Association, which is the largest body of psychologists in the United States, over here, headquarters in D.C. Because it's so big, there are subdivisions of American Psychological Association, so I belong to the Division of Trauma Psychology. I belong to the Division of Psychology and the Law, the Division of Psychologists in Private Practice. I belong to other organizations, the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies, which, as the name says, it's an international society where we are interdisciplinary, mostly psychiatry and psychology, researchers and clinicians, to really understand and further our awareness about trauma and traumatic stress. I belong to the International Society for Trauma and Dissociation. I belong to the Anxiety Disorders of Association of America. I'm a fellow in the American Board of Forensic Psychology. I don't know if I'm forgetting any.
Okay. Are any of these specific to interpersonal violence or trauma?
Well, clearly the trauma division of the American Psychological Association, the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies, and the International Society for Trauma and Dissociation, and then also the Anxiety Disorders of Association continues to talk about trauma because prior to this new DSM-5, PTSD was originally categorized under the anxiety disorders. So there are still colleagues and researchers in the anxiety disorders organizations who talk about PTSD and trauma.
Do you hold any leadership roles in these organizations?
Yes, I am currently the president-elect of the Trauma Division of the American Psychological Association. That is an elected position. You have to be elected by our membership. And now I serve as with the presidential trio, so there's three of us. You serve with the immediate past president, the current president, and the president-elect, so it's a 3-year term. And what we try to do is continue to disseminate best practices in trauma psychology and also interface with the larger American Psychological Association organization to continue to disseminate best practices and have just a voice for trauma psychology with our larger body and policy making. I've been involved in the Trauma Psychology Executive Board since its inception. I was a founding member of that division. I served as a membership chair, a program chair, an awards chair. I was the APA Council of Representatives, which means I was also elected to serve a 3-year term and sit on the governance board of APA, representing the Division of Trauma Psychology. So I've been very actively involved in the trauma division.
And what is the Division of Trauma Psychology?
So the Division of Trauma Psychology are psychologists who come together who want to disseminate best practices in trauma psychology. We want to make sure that we have our finger on the pulse of research and evidence-based interventions for people who are struggling with traumatic events that have happened to them.
Okay. Have you served in leadership positions of other professional organizations?
Yes, I was. There's a New York City-based organization. It's called the Women's Mental Health Consortium, and that's also an interdisciplinary organization. It's psychology, psychiatry, nursing, social work, and this was formed in order to give women sort of a referral base and more information about mostly like reproductive psychiatry. We know that certain difficulties and psychological difficulties that you have can erupt when you're pregnant or postpartum. So we wanted to have a number of resources available to women in the New York City area. I was a membership chair there for a number of years, and then I was the president of that organization, I think 2009 to 2017. I don't have my CV, but I think that's about right.
Why is participation in professional organizations important in your field?
Well, it's important to me because I do believe very much in service. I do believe very much in giving back. I do believe that it's important as a psychologist who believes strongly in trauma psychology and helping people that I can be part of a voice at the table, part of that push to get policy and understanding, especially with the insurance companies, to make sure that people are getting, the appropriate care that they deserve. So it's something that just has always been part of my life in varying degrees. And as a psychologist, I feel like it's a very rewarding part of my job.
Do you attend professional conferences?
Yes, I do, typically multiple times a year. Of course, COVID threw a little bit of a wrench in that since some things are virtual, but yes, I routinely attend conferences.
And why do you think that's important?
It's important to stay abreast of developments in the field. It's important to meet with your colleagues across the country and see what they're doing and what they're hearing and what's working and what's not working. So when you're at a conference and somebody's presenting new or novel research, then you can take that information and bring that back to your clients and bring that back to my forensic work. So it absolutely enhances the work that I do.
Have you ever been qualified to testify in the field of psychology as an expert witness?
Yes, I have.
How many times?
I was first qualified in 1998, so since then, about 50 times.
Okay. And how often in that 50 times has the specialty been in interpersonal violence and traumatic stress?
Probably more than half.
Okay. Have you ever worked for or testified for the prosecution in criminal matters, like the District Attorney's Office, U.S. Attorney's Office?
Yes, I have, frequently.
Okay. Do you testify for both sides in lawsuits, plaintiffs and defendants?
Yes, I do.
Have you ever worked on other cases that didn't go to trial?
Many.
Okay. Have you ever found an individual that you evaluated did not suffer from the effects of interpersonal violence or PTSD?
Frequently.
Okay. Have you ever not been qualified in court where you have been proffered to qualify as an expert in the court?
No.
Okay. Your Honor, I would at this time move to qualify Dr. Hughes as an expert in forensic psychology with a specialization in interpersonal violence and traumatic stress.
All right, any objection?
No objection to qualifying her as an expert in forensic psychology.
All right.
More specifically, forensic psychology with a specialization in interpersonal violence and traumatic stress.
Any objection?
No.
All right, so moved.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Hughes, please tell the jury what domestic violence, intimate partner violence means.
Sure. So I'm probably going to be interchanging the language domestic violence and interpersonal violence, and for purposes here, these are the same thing. So intimate partner violence is a pattern of manipulation, fear, and coercive control that happens within an intimate relationship. It constitutes using a variety of abusive behaviors, and that can be physical violence, sexual violence, psychological aggression, emotional abuse, stalking or surveillance behaviors, and economic abuse. The abusive behaviors occur over time, not all at once, and they're also interspersed with very normal times, times without violence, times with love and happiness, and it's this interpositioning of the violence with the love and the abuse, with the love and the care, that makes it very difficult for a victim to extricate herself from that situation and from that relationship.
And what would you say is the overarching dynamic of these relationships?
So the overarching dynamic is the abuse of power and control of one person wanting to have dominance in that relationship, say over most things that the couple or that the victim does or does not do.
Please tell the jury what coercive control means.
So coercive control is a tactic of victimization. The goal of it is to establish dominance. What coercive control does is that it imposes negative consequences for noncompliance with your partner's expectations or demands. And what that does is it erodes away at the victim's autonomy and her independence.
What is physical violence?
So physical violence is when one person uses their body against the body of another with the intent to cause injury or harm. That can be push, shove, slap, kick, punch, beat up, meaning multiple types of physicality in one instance, throw, slam into a wall, push into something hard that you could hurt yourself. Clearly, use of a weapon would be a physically violent act as well.
Does size and strength matter between the parties?
Yes, very much so. This is very well documented in the literature about violence and abuse in relationships, and that's just physics. That's just proportional force. That if a 185-pound man is going to push a 120-pound woman, that's going to feel quite different than a 120-pound woman pushing a 185-pound pound man. And it's just about proportional force and the size and strength differential. And that is why specifically, if you look at wrestling or boxing, they match weight classes. And they do that for a reason, because they know that it's not fair if somebody is bigger and stronger than the other. So it's certainly not the only factor, but it is a factor that one has to consider if a relationship is violent.
What is psychological aggression?
So psychological aggression is threats and the imposition of threats with the intent to control someone's behavior. So it's doing a threat so that you will modify your behavior and do what your partner wants. Some psychological aggression techniques are intimidation, slamming your hand on a table, punching a wall, throwing something, mumbling under your mouth, cursing, screaming, sort of these high emotional balance type of activities that can cause a victim to feel afraid and feel intimidated. And then if there has been an act of physical violence where that contingency has already been established, that this person, your partner, has said, okay, I not only have the ability to use violence against you, I also have the willingness to do it. The intimidating tactics take on greater flavor. They take on greater salience. They mean more because you know what could be coming down the pike.
What is emotional abuse?
So emotional abuse functions to denigrate a person's sense of self-worth and their self-perception. It's about name-calling, being very mean-spirited, putting yourself down, using gender-based language that's offensive, racial slurs, all types of behaviors to really make a person feel less than they actually should.
And what is sexual abuse?
So sexual abuse in an intimate relationship functions to establish dominance and establish power. What it is simply in the psychological and psychiatric communities is forcing someone to do something sexual against your will when you did not want to. It can be forced sex, either forced vaginal, oral, anal sex. It can be forced to engage in any other type of sexual act that you may not want to do. And when I say force, it doesn't mean it has to have physical force. There's a lot of psychologically coercive tactics that are used that many times when violence has already been established in the relationship, the victim often feels that she can't say no for fear of reprisal, for fear of retaliation, for saying no to those acts. So sexual abuse, does happen in intimate partner relationships. A lot of people don't want to talk about it, and they don't want to ask about it because it makes people very uncomfortable.
Is digital penetration of the vagina sexual abuse?
Action leading.
What, if any, role does digital penetration of the vagina play in sexual abuse?
If it is non-consensual, then it is abusive.
What, if any, penetration of inanimate objects into the vagina plays a role in sexual abuse?
Again, the operative word is consensual. If you are not consenting to those acts, then it is sexually abusive.
Okay. Is there a distinction between sexual violence and sexual abuse?
Not really. Sexual violence is a term of art. It is the overarching umbrella that we in the psychological and psychiatric communities talk about. So if we are looking at our diagnostic and statistical manual and say what are the traumas that could cause PTSD, it's listed as sexual violence. So it's an umbrella term that allows us to understand it could be childhood sexual abuse, it could be a rape, a sexual assault, it can be sexual abuse in an intimate relationship. So it's really just an overarching term that we use in the field.
What are
So it doesn't mean, I think people often mistake it to mean that when you are being sexually abused, that someone's punching you or someone's hitting you or someone's doing something like that because you hear the violence. It does not mean that. That could happen, but that term does not require that, nor does it mean that.
What are stalking or surveillance behaviors?
So stalking and surveillance behaviors are a common tactic of typically men who use violent behaviors in an intimate relationship. What they do is they allow the woman to know that wherever she is, wherever she goes, he's going to know. I'm going to maybe look at your phone, see who you're talking to, track you on Find My iPhone, look at your Instagram, look at your emails, really having a way of knowing all of the personal information about you. And what that does, it again erodes the victim's autonomy and it erodes her sense of privacy. She doesn't feel that wherever she can go, that somewhere he's not going to be part of her life in a very objectionable way. Sometimes there's the pop-ins. They'll show up at places that they're not supposed to be and that we don't want them to be, just as a way of checking. Sometimes they'll have friends or family check up on their partners to make sure where they are. What time did you get home? But you didn't turn off your phone at this time, but you came in the door this time. Like all of the sort of constant questioning and interrogation about an individual's whereabouts.
What about economic abuse? What is that?
So economic abuse is a way to, again, continue to maintain control over your intimate partner. Sometimes it's withholding information about the finances, of not letting you have access to the finances. If you can't have access to a credit card or a checking account or, Apple Pay on your phone, then you're rendered usually much more economically dependent on your partner, and that limits tangible options for you. For individuals where that sort of tangible options isn't there, we see the economic abuse or the economic restriction when one partner refuses to share any information about the funds. So it's not like I can't go shopping because I won't have money, but I don't have any decision-making in our family money. I don't have any idea of what we're doing in our family vis-a-vis our finances. So it's a way of definitely keeping that very separate and not in a consensual. Some couples make that choice. One person does all the money, that's fine. But when it doesn't come from a place of consensual choice-making, it can be abusive.
So you just described a number of these abusive behaviors. Are all of them present in every domestic violence relationship?
Right. No, they're not all present in everyone, and that's why it's very important to do a thorough assessment of a relationship that may be mired in violence to see which ones are present and which ones have a great impact in the relationship, which ones are sort of making the structure of this relationship.
After a sexual assault in an intimate relationship, how might a victim in those circumstances interact with her partner?
So this is one of the myths that people say, well, if she was sexually assaulted by her partner, she would have just left. And nothing could be further from the truth. That's not what happens, especially when it's your husband or your boyfriend or your partner. So what women do is they bury it. They compartmentalize it. They put it away. They avoid it because then they continue to reach out for the kind and the loving man that they got into this relationship with. The problem is that it does fester belief and causes more sort of psychological distress in the victim.
What, if any, role can shame or humiliation play in this coercive dynamic?
So that's one of the emotions that the victim is usually trying to suppress and compartmentalize and avoid and put away. One of the most frequently felt feelings after something so incredibly humiliating and violating is shame. And shame is a very sort of difficult emotion for people to have to live with and to have to experience. And then a lot of times what we see in these relationships, especially ones where sexual assault is perpetrated, there's typically the emotional abuse as well. So now if you're called names like a whore and a slut and easy and fat, and you're feeling the shame from the sexual assault that just happened, it sort of acts as a compounding effect, and it sort of kind of slowly deteriorates the psychological functioning of the victim, and where they're just really trying to get back to the good guy, get the good guy to come back, but they're suffering these symptoms underneath.
What about intimidation? What role does intimidation play in the coercive control dynamic?
Intimidation is one of the huge factors that we see in coercive control. Again, the goal is to get your partner to do what you want them to do. And if you've established that you can use violence and other sexual violence and physical violence, slamming your hand on a table, throwing a glass, breaking a door, throwing anything, causing a fit, yelling and screaming, that can rise the fear level in a victim that she may modify her behavior quicker, and he might not need to use physical violence, because he's already established that that fear is there.
What, if any, role could writing obscene messages play in being considered intimidating behavior?
Objection leading.
I said, what, if any, Your Honor?
Overruled.
I mean, certainly writing obscene messages to your partner could absolutely be an intimidating behavior.
What, if any, role does emotional abuse or degradation play in the dynamics?
So emotional abuse and degradation, as I stated before, functions to decrease your sense of self-worth. It decreases your sense of agency. It makes you feel bad about yourself. And when you feel bad about yourself, you're less likely to actualize and see options for leaving. You're so sort of mired in this dynamic of abuse that you come sometimes to believe the bad things that the person is telling you about. So, you know, maybe I am not talented and fat and lazy and stupid, and it interferes with that ability to problem solve and figure out, you know, can I get out of this relationship? And sometimes you feel you don't even deserve to get out of the relationship when the abuse is so chronic and so repetitive.
What role does surveillance as a means of control play in that dynamic?
So surveillance...
Objection leading.
I don't think that's leading, Your Honor.
Overruled, go ahead.
So surveillance functions to let the victim know wherever you are, there I am. So it makes her feel not secure in her movement, feeling that she has to restrict her movement. Her movement is not hers alone. It usually increases hypervigilance. It increases fear. It increases the need for yourself to mark where you've been and what you've done so that you can go back and prove it to your partner, because you know that there is going to be an interrogation later. When this pattern has been established, show receipts, you know, show me your iPhone, where were you, what's your Google location at? You know, those are some types of surveillance behaviors that puts the victim very much on edge and increases that level of anxiety and trepidation.
What role does possessive jealousy play in these relationships?
So possessive jealousy is a very difficult dynamic in intimate partner violence. It's very common in situations of coercive control. It's rooted in possession, that the gentleman feels that he can possess her and that he can have her whenever he wants. It's very possessive dynamic. But the accusations, the problem is when you make the accusations, the woman's forced to refute the accusations. So they're continuing in this dynamic where she's trying to prove, I didn't do what you said, this didn't happen. And then unfortunately, sometimes it escalates because the man is not taking the no for an answer, because this is a perseverative obsessive pattern that's very difficult to penetrate, that often these type of conversations lend themselves to physical and sexual violence.
Does this dynamic happen overnight?
No, it doesn't happen overnight. It happens over time. We don't, a woman doesn't get into a relationship with a man who's beating her up and sexually assaulting her and calling her names and doing all that. She gets into the relationships for all the right reasons, just like we all get into relationships, for love, for companionship, for kindness, for a future. But then slowly, all of these behaviors start to take form. And I say it's sort of like sucking the oxygen out of the room, and then before you know it, you're suffocating.
So, and that brings me to my next question. What role do physical abuse and coercive tactics play interspersed with normalcy and positive moments?
Objection compound.
I'll sustain the objection.
Okay. I'll figure this out some way. What role does love and normalcy play in these dynamics you've been describing?
Objection compound.
Overruled.
Thank you.
So love and normalcy are almost always in these relationships. That, when you are in a lull and the violence is not happening, you're back to sort of the loving man that you wanted, the person who you wanted to be with. And when you pair sort of this violent dynamic, physical violence, sexual violence, with love and attachment, it creates a trauma bond. It creates a psychological bond. An emotional dependency is created. So it makes it very difficult for the victim of the abuse to sort of extricate herself from that relationship, and for her to even believe frankly. I mean, that takes a lot of time to even believe that she can and that she should.
And what, if any, role does that dynamic you've described have in the victim thinking they can fix the problem?
So what do we know from the research? The research with working with battered men who come into treatment is that the only person who can change the abuse is the abuser. So no matter what the tactics that the woman uses, she's trying to do all these different things to fix him, to have him not be violent, to have him not be sexually violent, to have him not be obsessively jealous. And all those things don't change his behavior because it's up to him to change his behavior. And this was played out a million times in the batterers intervention groups that I led. And the men would tell us, it doesn't matter what she does. I don't care. So the problem is that the woman continues to think that she can fix it, and yet she can't. But she's the one who's then rendered sort of helpless and hopeless because everything that she's trying to do is failing.
What is the cycle of violence?
So the cycle of violence is one way to describe this domestic violence pattern. Typically what we see, and the cycle can be different in a variety of relationships, but typically what we see is in the first phase, so sort of multiple 3 to 4 phases. In the first phase, there's a tension building phase. You're sort of starting to feel that apprehension. He may be throwing his papers on the table a little more. He may be slamming the fridge door a little more. He may be mumbling under his mouth a little more. He may grab a glass a little more forcefully than he normally is. And then there's the incident phase. Then there's the blow up, where the violence, the abuse, the screaming, the sexual violence or the physical violence, all that occurs. Then we come to the contrition phase. I'm sorry. I didn't mean it. It wasn't me. I'm not going to do it again. The promises for change. And then we sort of slide into the calm phase where, this isn't going to happen again. I'm back to stable ground. I'm going to live in this place, this sort of honeymoon place. The problem in the calm phase is we often see the rationalizations and the justifications for the behavior. It's not like typically the man is taking full responsibility for what he did, but it's calm because there's no, violence and no sort of tension at that moment. And then it recurs. And then it recurs. So you're stuck in this vicious cycle of trying to figure out, how can I be with this man who hurts me, and yet I love him so much.
And what, if anything, does the term love bomb mean?
So the love bombing is, it's more of the colloquial term for the younger folks here, but, where you shower someone with affection and love, in this contrition and calm phase where, you're, everything about you is special. You're the best thing in the world. I'm never going to do anything to hurt you again. I would never let anyone hurt you. And it could be sending flowers and buying gifts or going on trips or your favorite restaurant. And that is, a way of where the man is trying to make those amends. And then it gets the woman hooked. So they get hooked on the kindness. They get hooked on the love. They don't get hooked on the abuse. I've never met one woman in the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds that I've evaluated who was not concerned about the violence. They're all concerned about the violence, but they go for the love.
So in your experience with these dynamics that you've described, does the victim ever yell at her partner?
Absolutely.
Why?
We know from the research that women use verbal and physical acts of aggression in these relationships. That's not uncommon. This has been researched for 5 decades. And a woman may yell at her partner because she's angry. And anger is a very normal emotion to having been abused. She can also be afraid, but they don't have to be mutually exclusive. We can absolutely, as human beings, feel 2 or 3 or 4 different emotions at once. People do often say to me, oh, she would never yell at him if she knew he was going to hit her. And that's not true. That's just patently not true. That's not supported in the research, and that's not supported in my clinical practice. The problem is there's a classic double bind, and the violence has been so normalized in the relationship now. She gets hit if she does yell, she gets hit if she doesn't yell. So for women who feel at certain moments that they need to preserve some sense of their autonomy and their independence and stand up for themselves, they will yell and they will fight back, even though the risk of violence is there. So it doesn't mean that she's not afraid and that she's not concerned about the violence. And it doesn't mean she doesn't also use placating and compliance strategies most of the time as well.
Does in the cases that you have and in your experience, does the abuse typically take place in front of others?
No, I mean, this is classically what we talk about behind closed doors. Most of the intimate partner violence, the domestic violence, happens, in the privacy of your own home. So sometimes we see the remnants of it, the after effects, or victims talk to their friends or family about it, but very rarely are you seeing it happen, the actual blow-up phase happen in the middle of witnesses and other people.
What does the term bystander effect mean?
So bystander effect means what happens when people are aware that domestic violence is happening. What happens when they're aware, even if they're not seeing it, that it could be happening. And what happens is we know that it's very difficult for people to stand up and say something. It's very difficult, especially in situations where there's a larger community of folks and the person who perhaps is perpetrating the abuse is the leader of that community. It becomes very difficult to go up against that, to go up against the sort of the head honcho of the community. People are very fearful of losing their jobs. I've seen this time and time again in the cases that I've worked on, either the Boy Scout cases or the clergy abuse cases, all of those type of cases where the USA Gymnastics, where when we go back and we look, we see people knew. But the secretary doesn't want to lose her job. She has kids to feed. The guy who, checks you in, he doesn't want to lose his job because he has a mortgage to pay. So people are quiet and they don't say anything. And then other people are very, it's a very worrisome dynamic. They don't want to put their foot out there if they're wrong, and maybe I didn't see it right, or I don't really know what happened. I certainly am not going to jeopardize my job if I don't really know what happened behind closed doors, even if I see a trashed room or a bruise. And then people still believe it's a family matter. It's between Amber and Johnny. Let them figure it out. I'm not going to get in the middle. So those are dynamics that happen.
What's the objection?
Motion to strike.
What's the objection?
We identified two names in the answer.
Overruled. Next.
Thank you.
Question.
Did you finish your answer?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay. What about mutual abuse? What is that? What role does that play?
So mutual abuse isn't really a term of art that we use. What we look at is situational couple violence and intimate partner violence. And when we look at situational couple violence, that really does characterize the majority of types of violence and abuse that happens in relationships. That's when a couple gets out of hand. They may push, shove, slap, yell, say some things that they don't want. And it's not that those behaviors are okay, but those are sort of what our larger scale community-based studies say happens in these relationships. That's distinguished from intimate partner violence, what I'm talking to you about, that has this constellation of symptoms and is rooted in the abuse of power and control.
Is there research that addresses this mutual abuse?
Yeah, there's research that addresses what does gender symmetry look like, male and female. Are they the same? And there's certainly, as I said, research that on the lower end types of violent behaviors, push, shove, slap, we may see similar rates between men and women. In psychological aggression, yelling, name calling, putting down, in some of our big community scale studies, we may see similar rates of perpetration in those behaviors. But then there are, other situations where we don't have gender symmetry. And what the research talks about very clearly is you have to examine context. You have to examine the differential of power and control and coercive control in the relationship to make a full determination.
Do women use violence in relationships?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, we've known this for 5 decades in our research. We've been studying this since the 70s. And when we look at what happens, women do report their use of violence. The majority of violence that we do see is what we call reactive violence or self-defensive violence, or sometimes violence that's perpetrated independently of an assault, of something that's going on. But mostly that when the partner begins to become violent, then she may become violent and fight back. And that's not an uncommon dynamic, that if somebody is being pushed or shoved or hit, that a person would fight back. That has been established in the research.
And what, if any, effect does that have on changing the power dynamics or the structure?
Well, you have to find out, does it? Does her use of violence change the overarching power structure of coercive control and violence and abuse in this relationship? And you have to examine those variables to see, does it or does it not?
Can men be victims of intimate partner violence?
Absolutely. Certainly, we know that we have to be careful of gendered stereotypes. We can't go in and think, oh, only the woman is the victim, and only the man is the perpetrator. That just does not comport with the research. We know that the research also shows that we can have domestic violence in same-sex relationships. My very first case was a same-sex domestic violence homicide in Brooklyn. That was in 1998. So I've been examining and treating individuals in a variety of types of violent contexts. So we have to be careful that that bias doesn't get in our way when we're evaluating a particular situation in a particular case. That said, we do know that there still are differences. In a heterosexual couple, in a male-female dyad, the research still is clear that there are differences. Men still perpetrate more severe acts of violence. Women are still more likely to be injured. They are much more likely to suffer sexual violence at the hands of their partner. They're more likely to be intimidated, afraid, and they're much more likely to be killed. So we know that those differences exist, but we do examine, in those individual circumstances, knowing that either one could be a perpetrator or a victim.
So how are you able to determine whether a relationship is a situational violence or intimate partner violence?
So I thoroughly examine all of those other variables. I look for the coercive control, who holds the power in the situation, who's able to say no, who makes the decisions, what are the consequences if you don't follow the decisions of your partner, is there sexual violence, is there intimidation and fear, are there statistical factors that are associated with severe and lethal domestic violence? So there's a lot of data that we have in the field that we can use to assess a particular relationship and really find out what's going on.
Does alcohol and substance use cause people to be violent?
No, it certainly doesn't cause people to be violent. We have plenty of people who can be, struggling with substance abuse and addiction, and they're not violent. But when you have a substance abuse and addiction and you perpetrate domestic violence, it does create a much more disastrous effect. It is a co-occurring variable, and we know that also from the research that the majority of the women will report that when their partner is drinking, the physical violence goes up. So a lot of the times when he's physically violent is when he's been consuming drugs or alcohol. When he's not consuming drugs and alcohol and he's not violent, those other behaviors continue to persist. The coercive control, the surveillance, the obsessive jealousy, the possessiveness, the psychological abuse, those usually persist. But the alcohol can just throw lighter fluid on a flame in a situation of domestic violence.
Is there research that looks at how women cope with the violence and abuse in their relationships?
Yes, there is.
Please tell me about it. What does it say?
So there's been a lot of research to talk about what do women do. That's the question that everyone wants to know. Why doesn't she just leave? And in asking that question, why doesn't she just leave, we actually are able to say, well, let me tell you what she does do. And what the research shows is women do a lot of things in that relationship. So there's sort of 3 main categories. One are the formal responses, the formal things that she does. Call the police, participate in prosecution of your partner, go see a therapist, go to a shelter, go to a hospital. These are sort of the very formal strategies that women can use. Then there are the informal strategies, and that's talking with your best friend, talking with your mom, talking with your friends, trying to get that emotional support from your social network. But the most common one is these personal strategies. And the personal strategies are really talking with your partner. They're trying to fix the relationship from within the confines of the relationship. You know, trying to get him to go to counseling, try to get him to go to church, try to get him to understand his ways, try to get him to get into AA or sober counseling or harm reduction model to help with his addiction, compliance with his demands, anticipating his demands, all these coping strategies that are sort of, you know, embedded within that intimate relationship.
Let's talk about the calling the police. Is that a common response?
It's not a common response. Many women do not want to call the police on their partners. You know, using criminal justice interventions in crimes of women and children are the least likely to be called into law enforcement. And most of the time when the police are called, it's because a particular incident has got out of hand and she feels unsafe. And the only way that she feels I can get this incident to end and stop is by calling law enforcement.
And if police are called, does the woman typically participate in the prosecution?
I mean, this has been a problem and a difficulty for prosecutors across the country since I've been doing this work. I'm actually frequently called by the prosecutor to testify about a fact pattern because the victim won't come in and testify. So dropping restraining orders, not participating in the prosecution is a very common dynamic in situations of intimate partner violence, domestic violence. And what we know, and what we know from our law enforcement data and colleagues, is that when you get that 911 call, they're very specifically trained to say, that's likely not the first episode. The chances are there have been more severe episodes before you get this call. So you can't go on the scene and think that this is the first episode of violence. And that's why a thorough assessment is supposed to be done when police officers arrive on the scene. So usually that episode that calls the police is just meant to stop that incident in that moment, to get a sense of safety. But most women don't want to participate and go forward with restraining orders.
Why do women in violent relationships stay in the relationship when the man's hurting them?
I mean, they stay for all the reasons we talked about in the cycle of violence. They stay for the loving man. They stay for the man who's kind. They stay for the man they decided to marry and had hope and promises for their future. So there's a lot of sort of love and attachment is why they're connected to their partner. Some people stay because they have economic reasons and they don't have tangible resources to leave. Some people have children in common and they don't want to deprive their children of a father. So some people fear retaliation. If I leave, I'm going to get seriously hurt. And frankly, the statistics bear it out. The most dangerous time for a woman is when she's leaving that relationship. Her likelihood of being killed grows substantially at that moment. So leaving sometimes isn't a best strategy. Staying keeps her safe. So there's usually a multitude of factors of why a woman decides to stay in the relationship. And again, as I said previously, it doesn't mean she's unconcerned about the violence. It's just she hasn't figured out a way out yet.
What, if any, role does emotional attachment and love play in that?
That's probably the biggest one, is that you have this, we talked about that trauma bond that has developed, that psychological attachment to your partner. You don't want to leave him. You've connected with him on so many other levels that giving that up just feels like a threat to your integrity. You're just sort of, and a threat to his, because you're just so intertwined and attached.
What, if any, role does hope and optimism play?
Hope and optimism are really what keeps victims alive in these situations. That's what gets them going from one episode to the next, to get up the next day and maybe he's not going to drink today. Maybe it's going to be on his good side. Maybe he's going to come home and not disappear for 3 days. Continuing to hope that some type of change is coming down the pike.
Now, you mentioned lethality a little earlier. Can you please explain to us what that means?
So lethality is means death, means fatality, and we have very well validated instruments and data that looks at what factors happen in a relationship where a woman ends up dead. And we do that through looking retrospectively, saying, here's, this person ended up dead, killed by her partner in a homicide, and let's see what factors were there so that we can work at preventing it. It's very methodologically sound over different case control designs over multiple cities, used by the FBI and law enforcement. So these are a number of factors that tell us that somebody is in a very dangerous situation. So some of the factors are an increase of frequency and severity of the violence, threats to kill, choking behavior, sexual assault, obsessive and possessive jealousy, controlling behavior, the perpetrator's use and abuse of substances, alcohol and substances, the perpetrator's threatening of suicide himself, right? Those are some of the top factors, and there are more that are very, very dangerous. When we hear that and we hear a woman is in a situation where those are present, then we are moving out of situational couple violence.
What, if any, role does destroying property?
And destroying property, destruction of property, personal property is also one of the risk factors for danger and fatality.
And what, if any, role does leaving threatening messages play?
Yep. That's also a risk factor for lethality.
What are the psychological and traumatic effects that such interpersonal violence has on victims?
Objection compound.
Psychological and traumatic effects are kind of interchangeable.
I'll sustain the objection.
What are the psychological effects that such interpersonal violence has on victims?
So these have also been well researched, and they are wide and varied. We see depression and depressive disorders, sometimes with suicidality. We see anxiety and anxiety disorders, a lot of stress. We see post-traumatic stress disorder. We see substance abuse and substance abuse disorders. We see trust difficulties and difficulties in interpersonal relationships. As a result, we see a lot of shame and humiliation. We see anger and rage, a whole sleep disruption, a whole host of difficult psychological consequences having sustained a relationship of intimate partner violence.
What, if any, role does low self-esteem play?
Well, low self-esteem is a very common after effect, and that, when you're embedded in the relationship, it also makes it just very difficult for you to climb your way out.
What is emotional dysregulation?
Emotional dysregulation, so it's a DYS, dysregulation, is when you sort of don't feel that you have control of your emotions. You feel like you're fluctuating, from one to the next. It's not the same as a bipolar disorder. It, can happen in short moments that, it's really because your central nervous system is so out of haywire from being exposed to so many traumatic events that you may feel things deeply and with a short trigger in a very quick time.
In your experience, is there a particular way victims of intimate partner violence remember the violence they endured?
Well, memory for traumatic events is something that has been well researched. Sometimes people have what we call dissociative amnesia, where because of the physical or psychic pain of what they're going through, a portion of the memory either gets blocked or can't get retrieved. Whether it's stored or retrieval, we're not really sure. But most of the times, the memory is really about when you have multiple repeated events of the same type of thing. So if you are abused multiple times and the abuse is very similar, it's very common for the victim to lose discrete details of a particular incident. They may not retain the memory for the complete incident, and that might not be to dissociative amnesia. That just might mean to forgetting because you have so many chronic events that have happened to you.
Are there common myths or misperceptions about domestic violence?
There are. I hope I've dispelled some of them here already, but I mean, the myths, certainly are that women are meek, are passive, are, just sitting there and letting the abuse happen, that women don't fight back, that women don't yell back, that some old ones, that they like the violence, they're not concerned about the violence, that if it was really bad, she really would have left. If it was really bad, she really would have told the police. All of those myths and misconceptions that just don't comport with the research.
Are there also myths about trauma survivors, how trauma survivors present?
Yes, there are, and what we say is, how lay people think someone who suffered a traumatic event is supposed to act. So in the immediate aftermath of a trauma, people think, oh, they should be hysterical and abreacting and emotional all over the place. And that's typically not the first reaction of a trauma survivor. The first reaction is, suppression, emotional numbing, emotional constriction. How do I get through this? Women who are beaten, they get up the next morning, they get their kids dressed, they get them to school, they go to work, they do a presentation in their office, they go on with life. The most normal thing that a person does who's experienced trauma is to get up and try to be normal. They're striving for that all the time. So sometimes if you see somebody who is more emotionally constricted, looks maybe stoic, looks like they're not feeling, it doesn't mean that they're not having internal reactions. We say this in the field of clinical psychology all the time. The inside doesn't match the outside. What you're seeing on the outside may not match what's going on for the person inside, because they have to be so controlled, because the fear is that if I let out a little of this emotion, I'm not going to be able to put the floodgates back on. It's just going to be too overwhelming. And that's true for people who are involved in litigation, and also true for my private patients who are, even though they're coming to me for help, they try very, very cleverly to not want to feel the difficult emotions of the trauma that they experienced.
And is it also possible that they can look very friendly and smile and laugh and things like that?
Yeah,
Action
absolutely.
compound.
Sustain.
What, if any, please describe some of the ways that a victim can hide that, as you just testified to.
We call that the appearance of normalcy, the appearance of competency, right? And it doesn't mean that they're not. It doesn't mean that they're not normal and that they're not competent, but it doesn't give you a bird's eye into their inner experience. And that's what we do in the rooms of therapy, where we really help people deal with that they keep to themselves. But yes, someone can be smiling and happy. It doesn't mean that they're not suffering inside.
Is there a single profile that fits all women in domestic violence situations?
No.
Is there a single profile of a man who perpetrates intimate partner violence?
No.
Your Honor, I'm at a point of moving to a new topic area. I don't know what Your Honor wants to do, because I know we switched the lunch around. I'm perfectly happy to keep going, but if this was a good stopping point, we could make that for the break.
All right, let's go ahead and take our afternoon break for 15 minutes, okay? Just do not discuss the case and do not do any outside research, okay? It's a little early. All right, and Dr. Hughes, since you are testifying, please do not discuss your testimony, including the attorneys at this point, okay?
Yes.
All right, we'll come back at 3:15 then, okay?
Thank you, Your Honor.
right. Are we ready for the jury?
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right. Be seated. All right. Your next question.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Hughes, did there come a time when you conducted a forensic psychological evaluation of Amber Hurd? And please tell the jury what a forensic psychological evaluation is.
Can you turn it on at the bottom base?
Okay. A forensic psychological evaluation is an evaluation that is conducted for the courts to answer a particular legal question. It contains multiple parts. Ms. Hurd is not a client of mine. She's never been in therapy with me. She's not under my clinical care. It is an objective evaluation to determine a particular legal question. Forensic evaluation follows a methodology that what we say it's a multi-method, multi-hypothesis-driven methodology, which means I look at a variety of different documents and data using multiple hypotheses. It's not just one hypothesis, one theory of the case. You're going in looking to see, what possibly could be going on here. And then you use the data to arrive at that opinion. You look for consistency across the data to arrive at that opinion. And the forensic psychological evaluation has many parts. It has the clinical interview part, a structured or semi-structured clinical interview where I'm asking Ms. Hurd lots of things about her life, both before Mr. Depp and after. It involves a psychological testing component of the evaluation, which allows me to do a good broad scan of different symptomatologies that people might have in their lives, as well as to have indicators of how she approached the test. Is she defensive? Is she malingering? Is she feigning? Is she exaggerating? It gives me indications about how she approached the evaluation. I review a number of documents, medical records, psychological records, the text, the audio, all the different things that we've had in this case, and then I conduct collateral interviews.
So, Dr. Hughes, just to be clear, do you assume everything the victim reports is true when you conduct these examinations?
No, of course not. I always approach a forensic evaluation with a healthy dose of skepticism. With any forensic evaluation, there exists a motivation that the individual may be telling you something that is not accurate. It doesn't mean that that's there, but you have to control for that and know that you're looking for, again, what does the data tell you, the external data, about what the person is also telling you.
Did the forensic evaluation follow a standard methodology, or was it specific to Ms. Hurd?
No, this is my standard methodology that I would use with any individual who's in a forensic matter, and I would be called to evaluate them.
When did you meet with Amber Hurd?
Okay, so I met with Ms. Hurd for a total of about 29 hours. I met with her for the first time in September 2019. I saw her for 4 visits in my New York City office. That's about 21, 22 hours. And then I saw her twice over Zoom. One was in January 2021. And
New approach? Okay.
Dr. Curry, in answering that question, were you consulting anything?
Dr. Hughes.
Dr. I'm so sorry. Dr. Hughes, were you consulting anything? Dr. Curry's here, I guess, as well. That's what confusing myself right there.
I'm consulting my cheat sheet of the dates that I saw Ms. Hurd so that I could accurately report to the court. I also have my final designation in front of me so that I could give the most accurate information to what I put in that report.
Okay, okay. And do you want to see that? Okay. Should we just take the break now and have him look at it, or does he want to?
Would you like to look at it now or before cross-examination?
It's just to post it.
Okay, before cross-examination.
Okay,
All right,
that's
that's
fine.
fine. Thank you.
Okay. Please continue. I think you were telling us when you saw Ms. Hurd.
Sure. So there were 4 dates in person in New York City for a total of about 21 and a half hours. And then I saw her in January 18th, 2021 over Zoom for 3 hours, and then December 27th, 2021 for 4 hours over Zoom.
And what did the evaluation consist of?
So as I stated, the evaluation consisted of psychological testing, a semi-structured clinical interview with Ms. Hurd, a review of a whole host of documents relative to this case and medical records and psychological records, and then 3 collateral interviews, 2 with her treating therapist, Dr. Bonnie Jacobs, Dr. Connell Cohen, and also with her mom.
And in the semi-structured clinical interview, what were you assessing?
Well, when someone comes in for the evaluation, you sometimes don't know what you're going to see or what you're going to get. So you absolutely have to do a full clinical interview and have a sense of their life patterns, things that have affected them in their lives, you know, where they have worked, where they have lived, just get a full sense of their sort of being before the incident for which they're talking about. Then I do a full intimate partner violence assessment, looking at all those characteristics that I talked to you about earlier to get a sense of the full structure of and the dynamic of this relationship. I also did looking at what were the effects, what were the psychological consequences of being in that relationship. And I also looked at the psychological consequences of some of the statements that were made by Mr. Depp through his attorney that are part of this, the counterclaim in this lawsuit.
At the end of that process, considering all the data, did you arrive at any expert opinions?
Yes, I did.
All right, I'd like to start with your main expert opinions and then go through those. Can you please tell the jury what your main opinions were?
So like I said, there are opinions embedded within them, but the main opinion is that Ms. Hurd's report of intimate partner violence and the records that I reviewed is consistent with what we know in the field about intimate partner violence, characterized by physical violence, psychological aggression, sexual violence, coercive control, and surveillance behaviors.
And what was the other main opinion that you had?
The second main opinion was that that Ms. Hurd demonstrated very clear psychological and traumatic effects or the exacerbation of trauma from those statements that Mr. Depp made through his attorney. There were 3 statements that we evaluated to see how they affected her emotionally and psychologically, and it was my determination that they did.
And did you arrive at any diagnostic conclusions?
Yes, I did.
And what were those?
I diagnosed Ms. Hurd with post-traumatic stress disorder.
And what, if any, etiology was associated with the post-traumatic stress disorder?
So the etiology is the cause. In order to meet criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder, you have to have an actual cause. It's one of the few diagnostic entities that we have to have a cause for, and the cause was the intimate partner violence by Mr. Depp. That was what was pushing the symptoms, that was what was related to the intrusive phenomena, that was related to her avoidance, that was related to her differences in her mood, that was related to her avoidance efforts. So it was the cause was the intimate partner violence by Mr. Depp.
Okay. Now, let's first go back to the forensic evaluation. You mentioned you reviewed documents. What documents did you review?
So I'm going to refer to my list of documents so that I can be clear for you all. It is a 4-page.
All right, if you want to approach.
Dr. Curry, if you, Dr. Hughes.
Hughes.
I don't know why I keep
Oy.
doing that. My apologies. Dr. Hughes. I think it's the confusion of having her in the courtroom. Dr. Hughes, if you need to consult your notes to answer something, let us know that you need to consult your notes. Otherwise, try to answer to the best of your ability. And then if you need to do that, just let us know you're consulting your notes, okay? The concern is that you not read from them, that you consult them as you need to, okay?
Correct. I just don't want this to be a memory test of having conducted many documents, 80 pages of notes,
But you
and 12
can-
psychological testings to,
You can reference your notes, just don't read from them, okay?
yeah, no problem.
Okay.
Okay, great. So please tell us what documents you reviewed. Please tell the jury.
Okay, so I reviewed a number of documents, a plethora of documents, most, and I obviously won't read them all, but I reviewed certainly all of Ms. Hurd's testimony that she gave in her deposition testimony in this case, her deposition or her trial testimony in the UK case. I did the same thing from Mr. Depp. I reviewed his deposition testimony as well as his trial testimony in the UK as well. I reviewed a number of the depositions that were put forth in this case. I reviewed the psychological treatment notes for Dr. Bonnie Jacobs, Dr. Connell Cohen, Dr. Laurel Anderson, and Dr. Amy Banks, although she did not have treatment records. So I reviewed not only their records, did collateral interviews with some of them, and also read their deposition testimony, and also read other medical records in this case, nursing notes in this case, in the highlights. And I also listened to the audios that were put forth in this case and read the text messages and emails.
And what, if anything, did you do with respect to any videos?
And I also saw the video in the kitchen. Yes.
Okay. Now, the collateral interviews that you conducted, why did you conduct those?
Well, collateral interviews is a standard part of a forensic evaluation. It's an opportunity to hear from another treating clinician, the person who's actually treating the individual you're evaluating, and get a better sense from that person of what they saw, what they knew, how they experienced this person. Sometimes our clinical notes don't give the full breadth of what really was going on in that therapy, because the notes are meant to be sort of short and to the point of what happened, who was there, and what was the plan. So it was really helpful to talk to these two clinicians who really were with Ms. Hurd throughout the duration of her relationship with Mr. Depp. So they give us sort of a contemporaneous look at what was going on for her emotionally, and then what was she reporting, what was she saying about the relationship to her therapist.
And you mentioned the name Dr. Bonnie Jacobs. Please tell the jury who Dr. Bonnie Jacobs is.
So Dr. Bonnie Jacobs was Ms. Hurd's therapist, and may I refresh my recollection with my notes, Your Honor?
She's allowed to
For the
consult
dates,
the notes.
if you'd like me to tell the dates.
If she's asking me a question,
Oh,
I'm not going to answer.
you're right, Your Honor. Yes.
May I?
Yes, you may consult your notes, yes.
Objection, Your Honor. Can we be heard?
Go ahead.
Oh, thank you. So she treated with Dr. Bonnie Jacobs, who is a psychologist, from October 2011 through August 2014. She actually was seeing Dr. Jacobs somewhat earlier, before she got in the relationship with Mr. Depp. And then she transferred care to Dr. Connell Cohen, who was referred by Dr. Kipper, who was the treating physician for Mr. Depp, and then later for Ms. Hurd. And she treated with Dr. Cohen from after she left Dr. Bonnie Jacobs in September 2014 to June 7th, 2016.
Okay, thank you. And so and I guess you got ahead of me there, so you also talked to Dr. Connell Cohen, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And you also spoke with Paige Hurd, did you say?
That's correct.
And who is Paige Hurd?
Paige Hurd is Amber Heard's mother.
Okay. And when did you speak with Paige Hurd?
I spoke with all of these individuals at the end of 2019. Again, I can check my notes and let you know the exact date if you'd like.
I think the end of 19.
Yeah, they all were
2019
in
is
the
fine.
end of 19, yes.
All right. And you are you aware that Paige Hurd has since died? She died 2 years ago?
Yes, I am aware, sadly.
Okay. Now, let's talk about the psychological testing. You stated that you conducted psychological testing, is that correct?
That is correct.
Can you
Overruled out loud.
Can you please tell the jury how many psychological assessments you administered to Amber Heard?
I administered 12.
Can you please tell the jury which ones you administered?
So I am going to refer to my designation that has the list so that I don't forget anything.
Okay.
So I administered...
Objection, hearsay, Your Honor.
She can refresh her recollection.
As long as she's not reading it.
Right, you just can't read, that. You're not supposed to read from it, but you can refresh your recollection as you're speaking.
So I can look and just look up, and that's refreshing my recollection? Okay.
All right, if we could approach for a moment.
Dr. Hughes, can you tell the jury the tests that you administered, please?
Yes, I can. I administered the Personality Assessment Inventory, which is a broadband instrument to scan for psychopathology and psychological symptoms that people have. I administered the Trauma Symptom Inventory, too, which is an instrument to scan for common traumatic effects that people have. I administered the Miller Forensic Assessment of Symptoms test, which is a measure of malingering. I administered the Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder Checklist for the 5th edition for the DSM-5. I administered the Clinician Administered PTSD scale for DSM-5. I administered the Beck Depression Inventory, the Beck Anxiety Inventory, the Mood Disorders Questionnaire, the Danger, I did 3 intimate partner violence measures, the Conflict Tactics Scale, the Abusive Behavior Observation Checklist, and the Danger Assessment Scale. And then I also did the Life Events Checklist, which scans and gets us to ask about a lot of traumatic events that an individual may have experienced, and we administer that typically before either doing the PCL or doing the CAPS.
Thank you. Were there any tests you administered to Amber Hurd that were designed to reveal malingering or feigning?
Yes, there were.
Okay, can you please tell the jury about those?
So malingering is the false production of psychological symptomatology for the purpose of some external material gain. Feigning is the false production of psychological symptomatology with no identification of what that gain may be. So basically feigning is saying your mental health is worse than it actually is. So I administered 3 of the tests, had validity indices built in that could allow us to address that question. The MFAS, the Miller Assessment, a Forensic Assessment of Symptoms test, is a specific malingering instrument. It looks at malingering psychopathology. Is this someone, malingering psychopathology? She scored a 0 on that scale. So on that test, sorry, not the scale, that test. So on that test, there was no evidence of malingering. On the TSI, there are 2 validity indices, and she scored within the normal range on those scores as well. One was slightly elevated, but when in testing the limits, because it has rare symptoms and over-endorsed symptoms, I determined that also was a valid measure. And then finally, the PAI, the large scale, 344 question instrument, has very robust validity scales on it to test for exaggeration or feigning or malingering, and she did not score in any of those scores and those scales at all. Those were not elevated. So the combined results between those 3 tests suggest to me that Ms. Hurd is not malingering her psychological symptomatology.
Now, Dr. Curry testified that one test showed, quote, intentional exaggeration in the 98th percentile, meaning that she engaged in extreme levels of exaggeration, end of quote. Do you agree with that?
I do not.
Why?
Because that test, the scale that she is referring to, it's called ATR. It's the Atypical Response Scale, As I said, that combines rare symptoms and over-endorsed symptoms. It's very frequently elevated in people who have high levels of distress. And then importantly, on this test specifically, it says, do not use the percentile rank. It is in the manual, it is in italices, because the way that this test was normed, it was normed on people who have trauma. So it's what we call negatively skewed. That means it falls on the tail end of the continuum. It is not a normal curve where we would normally think of how a percentile would work. So you would not use the percentile rank on this test.
You want to approach?
Yes, please.
Okay. I'll let the objection.
Dr. Hughes, please continue.
So that is a very inaccurate way to describe that scale and that test. And so the ATR scale on this test is probably the least robust of our validity scales, so you would never make a comment like that based on one scale if you don't have consistency across data. And when you look at the consistency across the testing with the PAI, the TSI, and the MFAS, and there's research to support that, that when they go together, you have a higher degree of likelihood that this is not feigned PTSD, that this is not feigned symptomatology. And then actually, if I look at the validity scores on the MMPI-2 that Dr. Curry administered, those scales are not elevated for exaggeration or malingering either. So if I add that, now I have really robust data that Ms. Hurd is not malingering or feigning her psychological symptomatology.
Thank you. Did you administer any tests that are specific to domestic violence?
Yes, I did.
Which ones?
So that was the conflict tactics scale, the abusive behavior observation checklist, and the danger assessment scale.
And what did they show?
Would like to refer to the testing.
To refresh
To
your
refresh
recollection?
my recollection, just a glance so
Yes,
I
you
can
may
be
do that.
clear with the jury. So what the overall gist of the testing was that, and the benefit of these tests is that they allow me to ask for what Mr. Depp did to Ms. Hurd and then also what Ms. Hurd did to Mr. Depp. So it was asking about both sets of behavior. And what
Objection, Your Honor. We're back to reading.
She wasn't even looking down. She was looking at the jury.
I don't. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Please continue.
So what these tests show was that there was a high degree of serious violence perpetrated by Mr. Depp toward Ms. Hurd. There was violence more on the mild level perpetrated by Ms. Hurd toward Mr. Depp, with one severe indicator, which was the punching that she indicated to me. There were scales about negotiation, about how much this couple tries to figure out their problems. They both scored, again, this is Ms. Hurd reporting that, but they both scored in the high range where they're both saying that, yes, we're trying to figure this out, we're trying to work out this relationship. There were scores on the psychological aggression scale where Mr. Depp engaged in more severe acts of psychological aggression, whereas Ms. Hurd did engage in also some mild and severe acts of psychological aggression. The amount of injury that was reported was significantly higher and more severe by Ms. Hurd, what she was subjected to, and then she was subjected to sexual violence where Mr. Depp, based on her report, was subjected to none. And then on the danger assessment scale, that there were a number of factors that were related to severity in violent relationships and a risk factor when we look, as I said earlier, when behaviors come up on this scale. They're very worrisome, very scary, and we have to take them seriously. So there were a number of behaviors that came up on this scale, such as Mr. Depp threatens to kill her, the increase in severity of the abuse, the forced sexual activity, the choking behavior, his obsessive jealousy.
Objection, foundation.
Talking about the test results.
Overruled, go ahead.
Please continue.
The obsessive jealousy, the control aspect, and his threatening of suicide to kill himself. So those were risk factors that placed her in the increased danger range. And this is a range that, says that we certainly have to advise women of their risk and consult with law enforcement if they're involved, or judges if they're involved, because this means that a woman is at risk for more serious or lethal domestic violence.
So did the results of the psychological tests you administered to Amber Hurd support a diagnosis of PTSD?
Objection, leading.
What, if any, psychological tests did you administer that supported a diagnosis of PTSD for Amber Hurd?
Sure. So there were 4 tests that supported that diagnosis. One was the PAI, which was that 344 question large scale personality inventory. On that test, her largest subscale, her highest subscale, was the one that measures traumatic stress. So that was clinically significant. On the TSI, 2 of her scales were the intrusive experiences dimension and the defensive avoidance dimension, 2 of the classic scales of trauma and PTSD. On the PCL, which is the post-traumatic stress disorder checklist 5, that she scored in all 4 domains of PTSD, and that's an instrument that says how much are you bothered by these symptoms, and in all 4 clusters, which would be the intrusive experiencing, when things about the abuse or the trauma enter your mind when you did not want them to. Sometimes they're cued, sometimes they're uncued. She answered in the avoidance category, which is a second category of PTSD, that I do things to try not to think about this, to try not to feel this, to try not to get upset. Sometimes I avoid certain people because they become a trigger for me. She scored in the what we call the negative alterations in cognition and mood, changes in her thoughts and feelings as a result of the abuse and trauma, and also in the physiological hyperactivity, the hyperarousal, the hypervigilance, the startle response. So on the PCL, she endorsed symptoms in all 4 of those categories, saying, some of these symptoms are bothering me a lot. And then finally, the clinician-administered PTSD scale for the DSM-5. And what that allows me to do, unlike the PCL, is really look at symptom severity and symptom frequency. How is this really playing out for this individual? And similarly, she scored in all 4 categories of trauma and of having intrusive experiences and nightmares and avoidance efforts and physiological hyperactivity and changes in her mood and her thoughts. And her total score was a 28, which falls in the moderate range. So that means that she has experiencing a moderate degree of post-traumatic stress disorder symptomatology. And those tests allow me to make that definitive diagnosis that she suffers from PTSD.
Thank you. What, if any, consideration did you give to Amber Heard's history of childhood abuse in making your diagnosis?
I mean, that was a significant consideration, given that we know that childhood, well, first of all, we know that people can experience multiple traumas across the lifespan. And we wanted to make sure that the symptoms that she was experiencing were related to what she experienced with Mr. Depp and not her childhood. And certainly, earlier on in the evaluation and when I evaluated and spoke with her, that was true. And that was also true on the latest measure, the clinician-administered PTSD scale for DSM-5, the CAPS-5. And that's because the content, you have to look at what is the content of the symptom. So it's not that someone says, oh yeah, something traumatic comes into my mind. No, what is it? What comes into your mind? What bothers you? What are the triggers? And those were all specific to Ms. Hurd's relationship with Mr. Depp. The reason the childhood is also significant is that we know that if somebody suffers childhood abuse as a child, they are much more likely to have an adult re-victimization. And they're much more likely then to be more vulnerable to obtaining a PTSD, to getting PTSD, if they've had that prior vulnerability. So it's a very strong vulnerability characteristic to obtaining PTSD when you have a subsequent trauma. The other aspect about her childhood abuse is that she was raised in a family of violence. She was physically abused by her father. She saw her father abuse her mother. Her father was very explosive and had violent outbursts. And both her parents also struggled with substance abuse very significantly. So she had learned from a very early age how to caretake, how to live in a situation that is mired in chaos. How do I take care of a parent who's passed out, nodded out from heroin? And how do I get up and get my sister to school? She learned at a very early age that she had to figure out how to do this in this scenario. And I would say lastly, what that environment taught her was that she learned that she could love someone who hurts her. She knew that people who hurt her also can love her. And she learned how to have this tolerance for cognitive inconsistency, this tolerance for two should be diametrically opposed emotions. But she grew up knowing or believing perhaps that this could happen. And she also believed that she could fix him, just like she tried to fix her father and just like she tried to fix her mother. She truly, truly believed that she could fix Mr. Depp and rid him of his substance abuse problems. But that did not work.
Did you review Dr. Curry's CAPS 5 that she administered to Amber Hurd?
Yes, I did.
And what, if any, agreement did you have with Dr. Curry's interpretation of the CAPS 5?
I didn't agree with her interpretation, having been a trauma psychologist for over 25 years and administered hundreds of these. I found that there were flaws in how she chose to administer it and then some of the coding. Ms. Hurd on that CAPS 5 to Dr. Curry certainly reported trauma-based symptomatology related to the abuse by Mr. Depp, but somehow that was not coded as such.
And did you review Dr. Curry's MMPI 2 that she administered on Amber Hurd?
Yes, I did.
And do you agree with her interpretations on that test?
No, I do not.
Why not?
Because this profile is a normal profile. There are no clinical scores elevated above 65, which is 1.5 standard deviations of the mean, which is what we use to determine clinical significance. And if none of those scales are elevated, it becomes very difficult for us to make assumptions about a person's psychology and their functioning. Now remember, the psychological testing generates hypotheses about a person that we then, using our clinical judgment, have to make a decision about. We have to make an assessment about it. And if none of those scales are elevated, it just doesn't give us rich information to make those determinations. The one scale which is accurate that was elevated was one that measures defensive responding, sort of a protective responding, an unwillingness to admit minor faults. That was elevated, and that was true. But the result of that is you have a defensive profile. You have somebody who's not giving you a lot of information. So the scales are all low. So there's no way you can take that MMPI and then say it meets, it's consistent with borderline personality disorder. You just don't have the symptom expression on it in order to do that.
And that's my next question here. What, if any, diagnoses did you make of personality disorders for Amber Hurd based on your testing?
I did not make a personality disorder of Ms. Hurd.
Why not?
For a number of reasons. Number one, a personality disorder requires a pervasive pattern in a variety of contexts. Two key words, pervasive pattern, variety of contexts. That means if her emotional instability, her affect dysregulation, or her fear of abandonment is only occurring in the relationship with Mr. Depp, and we don't have evidence of it before, and we don't have evidence of it after, it is not.
All right. Do you want to approach?
Dr. Hughes, what, if anything, did Dr. Cohen say to you about any type of diagnoses of personality disorders?
Dr. Cohen did not diagnose Ms. Hurd with any personality disorder.
And what, if anything, did Dr. Bonnie Jacobs say about diagnosing Amber Hurd with any personality disorders?
And Dr. Jacobs similarly did not diagnose Ms. Hurd with any personality disorder.
Thank you. Now, let's turn back to intimate partner violence. What types of physical violence were reported to you?
So there were a number of physically violent behaviors that were reported, that Ms. Hurd reported that Mr. Depp perpetrated. He pushed her, he shoved her, he slapped her with the front of his hand and the back of his hand. He choked her, he slammed her into the wall, he pushed her and she fell down. He kicked her in the back. Again, without looking at my notes, that's what I can recall.
Okay. And what type of injuries did Amber Hurd report to you?
She reported mostly bruising, pain, some cuts. She reported vaginal pain from some of the sexual assaults. She reported that she did have some scratches and cuts on her from broken glass. She reported that she believed she may have lost consciousness 2 times, once in the Australia incident and once in the December 15th, 2015 incident.
What type of coercive control was reported or did you find?
Leading.
Sustained.
What, if any, coercive control was reported to you?
So the coercive control that was determined in this relationship I found to be quite significant. There were many, many instances where Mr. Depp tried to control how Ms. Hurd went about her career. He didn't want her to show nudity. He didn't want her to show boob. He didn't want her to act with certain actors because of this obsessive jealousy. He criticized her ambition. He'd rather she not work. He called, the ambition as something as a negative thing. It made her very fearful to have to look at scripts or talk about scripts or talk about movie roles because he persistently put those down and told her she didn't need to work and she didn't need to do that and she didn't need to show her tits and ass. He didn't necessarily support her work. The way this manifested as well is that he called almost every actor that she had to work with. Males and females. So no matter what show she was filming or shooting, he would call the leading actor. He would call the director. He would tell you, I got eyes down there. I got eyes down on the set. So she never felt safe to be herself and be an actress in these films or productions because she'd have to come home and then endure his anger at her for doing something or for not doing something. When she was filming and he was in the same town, she feared that he would show up on the set and, to know what her call sheet, what she was filming that day. She, even told her assistant, don't give it to him, don't let him see it so that he won't show up. And sometimes he did. So it was very trepidatious for her and very anxiety-provoking that he continued to do this. He tried to control what she wore. When she was going out with him, things were fine, but he told her often, no woman like mine is going to dress like a whore, and didn't want her to wear revealing clothing, or revealing clothing according to him. She recalled an incident when she was going on a job audition, and he said, you're going to go out with those tits and ass? And she had to sort of go in and put on what she said, mom jeans, so that she didn't look sexy, so she didn't look revealing, and continued to try to plead with him about what jobs she could take and she could not take. This made her be very sort of restrictive and try to conceal things. She would hide her scripts because she couldn't read them in front of him because he would put them down or want to see where there might be nudity, where there might be something where she's doing a love scene. And then almost every person that she was in a film with, there would be those barrages of the consistent accusations of infidelity. And we saw that on the Australia pictures, the Billy Bob. He was one person that he continued, to berate her about having an affair with. That's what obsessive control looks like, those messages on the mirror. When you look at how he wanted her to there was some interference with the family, with her sister. When some things were leaked, he was obsessed, believing that it was Whitney who did it, and eventually Miss Hurd had to succumb and say, okay, yes, it was, and then alienate herself from her sister because she just couldn't take the fights anymore. She just couldn't take the constant barrage of criticism. So there were many instances when, in terms of their interactions, she would have to text him right back, but when she would text him, he could not answer for days. And it's this sort of, when we talk about, the ghosting, but your husband doesn't ghost you, your partner doesn't ghost you. And there were so many times of this sort of withdrawal of affection, which was on his terms and when he wanted to do it. I'm aware that there is, testimony in this case that, Mr. Depp decided to leave because he didn't want to be violent. And I do think that's true sometimes. I think he did leave in times where he didn't want an altercation. He did leave after an altercation. He did leave and then came back and continued the altercation. So leaving wasn't the defining variable. The problem was that, with this obsessiveness and this perseveration that he had, the fight would always come back. So leaving might end the argument for that moment, but Miss Hurd knew he was always going to come back, and he was going to, start the interrogation once again.
And what is the effect of the coercive control on Amber Hurd?
I mean, the effect was drastic. She talked to me that her roles consistently dropped over the time that she was in the relationship with Mr. Depp, just because it was so difficult to go on auditions, to want to be in a different location with him. Whenever she was not on location with him, it was very stressful. It was very anxiety-provoking because of the accusations of infidelity. We heard that through Isaac Baruch's testimony when she called and was saying, babe, there's no one here, there's no one here. That was something that she had to do repeatedly and constantly over the course of the relationship. So it caused a significant amount of anxiety, of distress, of having to try to conceal and maneuver around him to try to have the career that she wanted to have. It made her hypervigilant and definitely contributed to sort of her psychological symptomatology getting worse over time.
What about sexual violence?
So there was a number of incidents of sexual violence reported in this relationship. Those are documented early on in Dr. Bonnie Jacobs' notes, where when Mr. Depp was drunk or high, he threw her on the bed, ripped off her nightgown, and tried to have sex with her. There were times when he forced her to give him oral sex when he was angry. These weren't in loving moments. These were angry moments, moments of dominance, moments of him trying to get control over her. There was a time when they were in Hicksville in the trailer, I don't want to say trailer park, but I guess it's trailer park. It is a trailer park, where he was accusing her of a woman hitting on Amber, and that was the problem. Amber got accused of women hitting on her, and it got accused of men hitting on her. So there were so many targets that came through in his obsessive jealousy. But when he, on that incident when Kelly Sue was accused of hitting on Miss Hurd, and they went back into the trailer, Mr. Depp performed a cavity search and ostensibly was looking for drugs and felt it acceptable to rip off her nightgown and stick his fingers up her vagina to look for cocaine, felt that maybe she was hiding them there. And again, these incidents often happened in a drug-fueled rage. There was another incident in the Bahamas where when he got angry, he took his fingers and he put them in her vagina and moved her around violently in the closet. Again, an act of sexual violence. And of course, the incident in Australia was one of the most severe instances of sexual violence that Miss Hurd had to endure, in which when he was beating her and choking her and telling her, I'm going to fucking kill you, I hate you, I'm going to fucking kill you, and he grabbed a bottle that was on the bar and penetrated her with that bottle. And Miss Hurd reported to me of dissociating and going outside of her body, and the only thing she was thinking is, oh God, I hope it's not the broken one.
What, if any, psychological abuse did you find?
There was a number of psychologically abusive behaviors. As I stated, Ms. Hurd admitted to me and reported that she engaged in those behaviors as well. She reported that she did call him names and offensive comments and said things to him that were horrible, and that she was incredibly saddened and horrified by her behavior. And looking back, she, at this point, not being in the constant barrage of abuse, does not recognize her. The abuse by Mr. Depp, he called her a number of names, frequently whore, slut, cunt, lesbian camp counselor, easy, ambition. Ambition was a weaponized term in that relationship. So he called her a lot of names and humiliated her. And of course, I think we talked about the intimidation tactics that, Mr. Depp was often banging and throwing and hitting things in the household, which sort of got the tension to rise up very significantly, very quickly.
Can you tell me how you conducted your analysis to arrive at these conclusions?
Sure. So what I did was look at the incidents that were reported and look at the corroborating data around it. So as we stated, most of these incidents of intimate partner violence happen behind closed doors. Not everyone is going to witness what the parties are reporting behind closed doors. So you look at what is the data that surrounds it. Is there any data before it? Is there any data after it? Is the victim telling somebody in real time about what's happening? Are there therapy notes? Are there pictures? Are there text messages that sort of allow us to fill in the pieces of the picture, even though we don't have exactly what happened at that moment? The more collateral that we have and the consistency across those data points, it gives us greater confidence in our results.
Can you give us some examples?
Sure. So
Vague.
Overruled, I'll allow.
So, for example, the Boston plane incident, I believe, without looking, I know May 24th, 2014. This is the incident where Ms. Hurd and Mr. Depp were going to fly back to LA and spend the weekend together. They were shooting at different sites. Ms. Hurd is on the plane waiting for Mr. Depp to come on in the tarmac. He's reportedly sitting in the SUV, smoking weed and drinking. She is filming with James Franco at this point, and she gets on the plane and he starts talking about James Franco, making a lot of derogatory comments about her, and I hope you had fun with your escapades, and some more inflammatory language. And then in an argument, when she got up to leave, he kicked her in the back and she went forward on the plane. To the front of the plane, because he sat in the back of the plane. So if I look at what is the corresponding data to this, there's a therapy note, several notes in Bonnie Jacobs' records that talk about Mr. Depp's increasing use of alcohol and his obsessive jealousy around James Franco before this Boston plane incident. After the incident, Ms. Hurd told her friend Io, she told her friend Savannah, she told her friend Rocky. Ms. Hurd did not go home. She was afraid to go home. So she went to a hotel, because when Johnny was in these states, he would often show up because he's still in that drinking and drugging phase. And he talked about that. That was the roxycodone before he detoxed. He was still in that, high substance abuse phase, that he would often show up at night, and that did not feel safe. There was a text from Stephen Duders, Mr. Depp's assistant.
All right, you want to approach?
All right, so, Dr. Hughes, let's go past that text and talk about, go past that text and continue after that text.
Sure. So there was, Mr. Depp apologized to Ms. Hurd for that incident. Mr. Depp said in his UK testimony, well, I only maybe playfully tapped her on the back with my foot. Mr. Depp texted Paul Bettany and talked about how he was so drunk and out of control and engaged in bad behavior. He texted his friend Patty Smith a very similar type of text about how drunk and out of control he was. And then finally, Amber Hurd wrote an email talking about how distressed and heartbroken she was.
Objection, hearsay.
I mean, I don't agree.
I know. Sustained. I'll sustain the objection. Next question.
All right. Can you give another example?
I think those are all I can remember at this point.
Okay. What if any, sorry, I'm going to have to go a little bit further here. So you concluded that Amber Hurd used psychological abuse and some reactive physical violence, I think I heard you say. Is that correct?
Objection, leading.
Overruled.
Can you please explain to the jury what you meant by that?
Yes, that is correct. That, Amber Hurd reported to me some of the behaviors that she used that were psychologically aggressive, the name calling, the putting him down and calling him very bad names and insulting his fatherhood, and she was very shamed and remorseful about that. She also indicated, using, and as some of the testing showed, minor forms of violence, pushing, shoving, throwing objects. We see that a lot with women when there's not proportional force. Women are more likely to throw objects. And then the more severe act of punching him, which a punch falls in the more severe category. And the context, as she explained it, was that he was coming after Whitney, and she stood, her sister, and she stood in the way and she punched him.
Now, does that make Amber Hurd a perpetrator of intimate partner violence?
Objection, leading.
Overruled.
So that was one of the tasks that I had to consider. That was one of the hypotheses that I had to consider. And given all of the other data, that was not my opinion.
Okay, thank you. Now, you stated that you read a number of therapy records. Please tell the jury, why are therapy records important?
Therapy records are critical for a forensic psychologist. When we have the opportunity to go back in time and see what a person was dealing with, what the content of their distress was, and what the symptoms of their distress was, it really gives us a snapshot in time. So they become very critical as part of the overall forensic psychological evaluation, because we as psychologists understand how people sort of treat in therapy and what to look for. So in looking back at Ms. Hurd's therapy records, we see sort of real-time unfolding of this dynamic in this relationship. We see early on in her notes in her report with Bonnie Jacobs and in Dr. Bonnie Jacobs' notes, reports of constant concerns about Mr. Depp's substance abuse, constant concerns about him passing out and vomiting, constant concerns about not wanting to...
Objection, Your Honor. Hearsay.
She can characterize that and say she relied on that.
Overruled.
Thank you. Please continue.
Constant concerns about how do I get him into treatment, how do I get him help. Ms. Hurd starts going to Al-Anon at this point, early 2012, in the beginning of the relationship, because she has to figure out and wants to figure out a way to support the man that she's dating right now and the man who she's falling madly in love with. There are reports in Dr. Jacobs' notes early on about his controlling behavior, about his jealousy behavior, about him not wanting to do certain jobs, of not wanting her to wear certain clothes. So this is going back to 2012 with no indication of why would she be saying that, but for the sole purpose of trying to get help and trying to get guidance in this relationship that she finds so difficult. There are indications, as I mentioned before, of the sexual assault and the sexual abuse, and how he would, you know, when he was angry and when he was drunk, it was mostly drug and alcohol fueled rage when he would, you know, throw her on the bed and try to have sex with her. And then, you know, if he was not able to perform, he would get more angry at her and blame her. So we have this dynamic of blaming her for his inability to take responsibility for his behavior. Those themes were throughout Dr. Jacobs' notes.
Did Dr. Jacobs assign any diagnoses to Amber Hurd?
She did. Early on, she diagnosed her with panic disorder, and then later with post-traumatic stress disorder.
All right. And did Dr. Jacobs diagnose Amber Hurd with borderline personality disorder?
No, she did not.
Histrionic personality disorder?
No, she did not.
And is that important?
That's very important when we're trying to figure out the course of somebody's illness, the course of somebody's psychiatric difficulties. As I stated, well, I don't think I got to state, personality disorders usually start in adolescence early.
Objection.
I'll sustain the objection. Next
Okay.
question.
Okay. You also stated that you reviewed Dr. Cohen's treatment notes, correct?
Correct.
And you also read his deposition testimony?
Correct.
And you had how long of a collateral interview with him?
I believe it was 2 hours.
Okay. And what did you get from all of that data?
So by the time that she gets to Dr. Cohen, which is 2014, I believe, September 2014 is when Dr. Kipper comes on the scene. Ms. Hurd's psychological functioning is significantly deteriorated. She's suffering more anxiety, more sleeplessness, more agitation, more emotional dysregulation, this fluctuation in moods. And when you sort of look at the records of what happened in those first 2 years from Dr. Jacobs, and now we have up to Dr. Cohen, and we see all of the incidents that she was exposed to, including the sexual violence and the coercive control, it makes sense to me that her status, her psychological functioning has deteriorated. And in Dr. Cohen's notes, that's what he's always trying to do. He's trying to help Mr. Depp, help her act in a way so that Mr. Depp does not hurt her. Dr. Cohen was very concerned for Amber Hurd's safety, as was Dr. Bonnie Jacobs. Dr. Jacobs was very concerned for her safety, and she continued to talk about safety aspects for Ms. Hurd, as was Cohen. They did, both of them, both therapists, understood, and Ms. Hurd talked to them about it, that there were times that she fought back and she used violence, and times that she screamed and she said things that she didn't want to. But nevertheless, that did not change the balance for them either, and they were very concerned that because of Mr. Depp's significant substance abuse and his sort of poorly controlled anger, that at some point he was going to seriously hurt her.
Did Dr. Cohen provide Ms. Hurd with a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder?
No, he did not.
Did he diagnose Amber Hurd with histrionic personality disorder?
No, he did not.
Is that important?
It's important that you have an individual, Ms. Hurd, who's in therapy for over 2 years with one therapist and over 2 years with another therapist, and you're not seeing those characteristics of a personality disorder. If the manifestation of a person's difficulties and illness and symptomatology is better explained by another disorder, then you don't qualify for the personality disorder. You can't get the diagnosis. I mean, that's part of the criteria. So if it's not a pervasive pattern in a variety of contexts, and it can't be better explained by her trauma experience and the exposure and the symptoms as a result of that trauma, then you don't get a personality disorder. And that's why they didn't diagnose it.
Did you read Dr. Amy Banks' deposition testimony?
Yes, I did.
And what were her findings?
So Dr. Banks had one session, one couple session with Mr. Depp and Ms. Hurd. Dr. Banks is very reputable. She works up at the Harvard Medical School Cambridge Victim of Violence Program, which is a very well-known program for understanding the...
Objection, Your Honor.
What's the objection?
It's non-responsive to the question. The question was, what was the findings?
All right.
Tell the jury who Dr. Amy Banks is.
And just like I said, so she's somebody who has a wealth of experience in understanding intimate partner violence and the dynamics of violent relationships. But she only had one session with the couple, and it was her determination when they were both there and the violence was talked about that Mr. Depp did not deny the violence that he perpetrated toward Ms. Hurd. She also did, as everybody has, all of our other therapists, because Ms. Hurd admitted as such, that she also used low levels of violence as well. So Dr. Amy Banks had that opinion.
Did you review Dr. Laurel Anderson's treatment notes and read her deposition?
Yes, I did.
Okay, and what was the significance of what you learned from Dr. Anderson?
So Dr. Anderson similarly thought that there was violence and abuse in this relationship. She was the one therapist out of the 4 who qualified it as mutual abuse, which the termination I've talked to you about, I don't necessarily agree with. But she did see and did understand that there was violence and abuse by Mr. Depp. What was most notable was that after the December 15th, 2015 episode, Ms. Hurd called her, in addition to calling Connell Cohen, and reached out to a number of people, but she saw Dr. Anderson in her office, and Dr. Anderson saw 2 bruises on her face and told me, my husband kicked me, and he pushed me, and he punched me in the head. And should I call the police?
Objection, Your Honor.
What should I do?
She's not reading, Your Honor. She's just saying the significance.
Sustain the objection. Next question.
All right. What were your, what conclusions did you make as a result of what you reviewed for Dr. Laurel Anderson?
My take of reading Dr. Laurel Anderson's deposition and seeing her, redacted notes was that, from my professional opinion, this was a very serious incident and a very serious allegation of intimate partner violence by Mr. Depp. If a patient comes into my office with 2 bruises and alleges being pushed, shoved, and kicked by her partner, I'm going to be very concerned, and I'm going to mobilize a lot more resources to help that individual. And for some reason, that did not happen for Ms. Hurd.
What are your overall clinical impressions from reading these notes from Amber Heard's treatment providers and their couples therapists?
Objection, compound.
All right, sustained.
What are your overall clinical impressions from reading what you told everybody you read?
Objection, compound.
I mean, I don't know how to get it less compound, Your Honor.
Overruled, go ahead.
Thank you.
So my overall impression of the treatment notes was, there's significant support for the fact that there was intimate partner violence in this relationship. It was consistently reported over time, and there were couples therapists who saw and understood that. There were, Mr. Depp also attended a session with Dr. Connell Cohen with Ms. Hurd. And in that session, he was very belligerent and mean and yelling and intimidating, and he even got up and stormed out, rolled a joint, and then came back later. Dr. Connell Cohen's impression was this is somebody who's poorly controlled. That's the same thing that Dr. Laurel Anderson said about him. And he stormed out of one of those sessions too. So there were a total of 6 sessions, couple session, but Mr. Depp stormed out of 2 of them. So there were only 4 couple sessions for these 2 individuals in this just highly volatile, highly damaging relationship that was, punctuated by the coercive control and the intimate partner violence.
What, if any, observations did you make about Amber Heard's psychological status over that period?
I mean, the record was very clear that her psychological status deteriorated as she was in the relationship with Mr. Depp. She kept getting worse. She was losing weight. By the end, she was down to, I think, 105 pounds from about 125, 130. She was taking significantly more medication than she's ever taken in her life. She was having more panic, more anxiety, more distress. more affect dysregulation, just really an inability to regulate her mood, more anger outbursts. So it can significantly deteriorate over time.
You talked about weight. What, if any, diagnoses did Bonnie Jacobs make about Amber Hurd having an eating disorder?
There was no evidence in the record that Ms. Hurd had an eating disorder.
What, if any, observations did you make about whether Dr. Cohen Connell thought she had an eating disorder?
There was no indication in his record that she had an eating disorder.
Now, what, if any, observations did you make about the impact of Mr. Depp's substance abuse?
So the substance abuse was a very relevant and complicating factor to this relationship. When you pair that level of substance abuse with the level of intimate partner violence and coercive control, it's a very, very disastrous mix. And one of the things that happens with the substance abuse is a very similar dynamic that happens with the intimate partner violence. That there's the lying, there's the hiding, there's the cheating, there's the obfuscation, the rationalization about the drinking, the rationalization about the violence, the trying to, promises, I'm going to do better, I'm going to get clean and sober, I'm not going to hit you anymore.
Objection,
So
Your Honor. Can I be heard?
Everyone approach?
What, if any, dynamics and coping styles are connected to the substance abuse by Mr. Depp?
So they share similarities. There's a lot of lying when somebody's a substance abuser. There's a lot of hiding. There's a lot of concealment. There's a lot of rationalization. There's a lot of blame, blaming your partner for your inability to stay clean and sober. There's a lot of the promises to change and the promises to get better. So a lot of these dynamics sort of co-occur, in a situation of substance abuse and domestic violence. They're very similar. The difficulty in this relationship was that the majority of the violent episodes and the sexually violent episodes were in these alcohol and drug-fueled rages. That was predominantly when those happened. When he wasn't in those stages, we still saw the obsessive jealousy and the coercive control and the possessiveness. That still persisted. But when the alcohol and the drugs came together is when Amber Hurd was more in danger of being hurt by him.
Why didn't Amber Hurd leave the relationship sooner?
I mean, you know why she...
Objection, speculation, Your Honor.
Have you formed, based on your experience and based on your 29 hours of clinical evaluation of Amber Hurd, what is your understanding of why Amber Hurd didn't leave the relationship earlier?
Objection beyond the scope of the disclosure.
It clearly is not. I mean, it's clearly in the disclosure. Point to where you say it's not. I mean,
Point to where you say it's not.
You're
I'm not-
at-
Could you come forward?
now, you indicated that your main opinion was that Amber Heard's report of violence and abuse in her relationship with Mr. Depp is consistent with what is known as intimate partner violence, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And why did you believe that Amber Heard, what formed your basis of that opinion, in a nutshell?
Asked and answered, Your Honor.
Overruled, I'll allow it.
The basis of the opinion was looking at all the dynamics in this relationship, looking at not just the hitting and the yelling, but looking at how much more hitting was done, looking at the coercive control, the obsessive jealousy, the possessiveness, the sexual violence, the choking behavior, the threats to kill. Those are all, as I stated, very significant and often found in cases of lethal domestic violence. Those were significant severity factors. And looking at all those, that's what tipped the scales, that even though she yelled and said some horrible things and hit him, it never was able to shift the balance of power and control in that relationship.
Now, you have discussed with Amber Heard and you have reviewed and evaluated the emotional impact on Amber Heard as a result of emotional distress as a result of the 3 counterclaim statements, correct? The 3 alleged defamatory statements made by Mr. Depp through Mr. Waldman, correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
Objection,
And-
compound leading.
Just
Overruled, I'll allow it. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you. Could you please tell the jury what psychological impact these statements had on Amber Heard?
Yes, so there were 3 statements that I evaluated. May I check my notes to give you the dates and my recollection so that I can be clear?
Since I couldn't put it in, that might be the fastest way, Your Honor.
I'd rather she not address the court. I mean,
I'm sorry. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So there were 3 statements on April 8th, 2020, April 27th, 2020, and June 24th, 2020 that I queried her about and asked her about. The one that, what happens is if somebody who, like Ms. Hurd, has trauma-based symptoms and PTSD, we say that PTSD is a cue-based disorder. There are things that happen in the environment that trigger it and make it worse. And have to refute that your report of violence and abuse is a hoax makes that trauma activated. So it makes the PTSD symptoms at that time become more intense and more severe. So she would have more intrusive thoughts, more nightmares, more sleeplessness, more difficulty engaging with other people, depression, sadness, stress. All of that would happen when one of these statements came out. The one that was, the most difficult was the one where they said that her sexual violence
Objection, Your
was
Honor.
a hoax.
What's the objection?
I think she's going to the, to
Oh, I'll overrule objection. Go ahead.
Please continue.
The one that was most difficult for Ms. Hurd was the statement about calling her sexual violence a hoax. As I stated earlier, most women try very diligently to put that sexual violence in a box, bury it down, not want to talk about it, not want to have anything related to it come up. And, she's done, by my estimation in her coping, although she suffers from post-traumatic stress disorder, she also has a high degree of coping strategies. But when this would happen, it sort of would just, everything would deteriorate. And this is the one thing that women are always afraid of, that no one's going to believe them. No one's going to take them seriously. And when somebody comes out in the popular media and calls your experience a hoax, that lended itself to more severe psychological and traumatic symptomatology for her.
Dr. Hughes, are all of your opinions that you have provided today within a reasonable degree of psychological probability or certainty?
Yes, they are.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, I think this is a good time to go ahead and break for the day. We can have cross-examination and redirect tomorrow of this witness, of Dr. Hughes. So if you could have a good evening, do not discuss the case with anybody, and don't do any outside research, okay? And we'll see you in the morning. Thank you. Okay. All right, Dr. Hughes, since you're still in the middle of your testimony, please don't discuss your testimony with anybody, including the attorneys, okay? And anything that you looked at, referenced during your direct examination, if you could just turn that over so they can review that before cross-examination, okay? All right, thank you, ma'am.
Your Honor, may I just, I presume she wants to be able to take that back with her and
We can
review
get copies
overnight.
of it. We'll get whatever it is.
Okay, good.
We'll make sure you get copies of it, so make sure you get copies of it so she can keep her originals. Okay?
Yes, thank you.
All right.
I have copies of everything that I looked at. Other than
Okay,
my
well, no, we're not talking right now. Court's in session.
than my
Thank you.
Post-it note that-
All right. So anything else then? So we'll see you tomorrow at 10 a.m., correct? All right, thank you. Have a good evening.